Imagine you are an officer at port control. It is your job to decide whether a certain vessel enters your port or doesn't get permission to get in. But this time it's different. There's no captain on this ship. It's an autonomous ship, so is there an AI running it? Where is it from? Should I allow it? That's a decision of the future, well, of the near future. That's what we're going to find out today. Welcome to Threat Talks. My name is Lieuwe Jan Koning, and here from headquarters at Onto It, we bring you the next episode. And the title of this episode is Predictable is Hackable. Let's get onto it. Welcome to Threat Talks. Let's delve deep into the dynamic world of cybersecurity. Let me introduce our two guests of today. First of all, like last week when we talked about the maritime industry, I'm really thrilled he is here again. His name is Stephen McCombie. He is the professor of Maritime IT Security at the NHL Stenden University. And he's such a big track record in cybersecurity. He's been in the industry for years. He's been in the Australian police, for example, for years. And he's also created and led the IBM incident response team. He's been advising many companies and organizations on the subject of cybersecurity and cyber risk, also outside of the maritime industry. So he knows a lot about all these subjects. So I'm really thrilled he's back. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And on the other side, friend of the show, Hans Quivooij. He is the CISO of Damen Shipyards. Now, Damen Shipyards is a maritime solutions provider. That means, at least among very many other things, they are building ships, right? So any ship you can imagine, Hans can probably make sure you with a small.
I might get you a discount, but
a little discount. I might need it. But any ship that you can imagine, almost, is what Damen Shipyards build. So, and they're a very innovative company. So they're looking into the future, and the future of autonomous shipping. That's exactly what we're going to talk about today. So I'm thrilled to have, gentlemen, have you both. Welcome.
Thank you.
Let's explore a little bit this future that we're talking about. So autonomous shipping, can we compare this to autonomous driving like cars? Stephen?
I mean, obviously there's a lot of similarities, but the big challenge for ships is that they're remote. So if a ship's autonomous without any crew, if there's a problem, there's no way of actually dealing with it. And with a cyber attack, we're talking about the cyber systems on the ship being compromised, the same systems we're relying on for that autonomy and for safety. So that's the challenge.
Mm-hmm. Is there, on such autonomous ships, is there really no staff at all, or is it just autonomously controlled?
There are different models where they have small crews, or just certain functions are done. But at the moment, the challenge for crewed ships is the lack of cybersecurity knowledge on a ship. An autonomous ship's always going to have a lot less staff, a lot less possibility you have a cybersecurity expert.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but if there's no staff, there's also no insider job. Or am I mistaken there?
Well, the insider could be in a provider that actually helps maintain the systems remotely.
Yeah, the people are still there, but you're just not on the ship at that moment in time. Yeah. And Hans, what's your...
I think we have also a lot of some similarities, but also a lot of things which are completely different. If you look, for instance, to the auto industry, you also have a very high volume. You have a high level of standardization. If you look at, we're a big shipping company, or we're a big ship construction company, I should say. But the reality is we build, if we're lucky, we do 200 vessels a year. Yeah, just compare that to the auto industry, where you might have, you have thousands of vessels or thousands of cars being manufactured, which are highly standardized. Mm-hmm. In our situation, and we're not different than any other ship constructor, that doesn't happen that way. You will have a lot of bespoke things. You will have a lot of changes. So
no ship is alike, almost.
You could almost say that. We have all ranges of series which are very much alike, but that still doesn't count into the thousands.
How far is Damen Shipyards currently with the thinking about these autonomous ships?
We have them. We're actually...
so it's not the future, it's
not the future, and it greatly depends on the type of vessels. We're currently doing a number of initiatives. We're doing some for public transportation, small like ferry-like, we call them, pretty much basically a ferry or a water taxi or something in between. We're also doing certain initiatives together with the Dutch military. For autonomous vessels, and you can think of some see like drones or something like that. I won't go into the details there. But yeah, we're definitely working on that.
Mm-hmm. And forgot my question. So if you're talking about these autonomous ships, how autonomous are they? Do you mean then there's nobody on there, or is it more like assisted? Is there like a panic button for someone to press?
Right now, of course, what you will see, because it's not a fully completed product yet, there will be people on board. They can push the proverbial button you're referring to when it really is needed. But the goal is, of course, to have as minimum of staff or no. And once again, that greatly depends on the type of vessel, what it's going to do. You can think of a situation where you might have certain pods which might take the role of a tugboat, for instance, in a harbor, which basically will mean that you have a thruster which you can actually kind of remote push against the vessel in order to do the job a tugboat would have. That would not require anybody on board. But the moment you're talking about something which is bigger than, or depending on the type of vessel, then obviously it would change. So it really depends on the type.
Mm-hmm. And what about the responsibilities? I mean, back if we are looking at self-driving cars, for example, some of us have been in Waymo's in San Francisco, for example, where there's no driver anymore. And that's a weird situation because the driver, that would be the captain of a ship, is the one responsible if there's a collision, for example. How does that work in the maritime industry?
I think we're going to probably need some legislation for that. I don't really know if there is already legislation.
On international waters?
International waters, that's probably the easiest part. But the moment you get into harbors, that's going to be a different situation.
Yeah. Yeah, and when we're talking about cars, that is, I don't know how we're actually going to solve it, but someone has to be, in the end, pick up the ticket if something goes wrong, huh? Would that then become the shipbuilder? Are you going to be responsible, for example?
Well, that kind of depends whether or not. I think you have obviously depends on what really happens. Right now, the moment you deliver a vessel and you hand it over to the customer, they take ownership, they take responsibility. But indeed, it's the moment if you provide a autonomous vessel, then you're no longer just a fabricator. You're also, to a certain extent,
captain.
also you're the exploiter. You're the operator of the vessel at such a moment because your technique makes certain that it runs and that it runs remotely, etc., etc. So yeah.
Stephen, do you think the industry is ready for this from a cybersecurity perspective?
I think it's interesting, and talking about the responsibilities in terms of the regulators. Yeah, it's important to keep watch on a vessel, and like an autonomous vessel, there is no one actually doing that watch if it's not manned, and that's quite a challenge. You think about historically collisions, is most of them more than 50% because the watch wasn't effective. They weren't aware of their location, their situational awareness. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a big challenge, and how they're going to have the legislation reflect that keeping watch in an autonomous system. I think that's a really big issue. And
keeping watch, is that as simple as having a radar and a GPS system, for example, and make sure that you indeed know who you should not collide into?
Well, I think it's more than that. It's actually looking out the windows, understanding where the vessel is, the location, the other vessels in the area, a whole range of things. I mean, you could say, okay, let's build a system that's with a bit of AI that's going to be able to have this situational awareness. But in the end, who's responsible for that watch? Because in the end, I mean, the nature of maritime law is the fact that there's one throat to choke. There's the captain, he's or she is responsible for the vessel in terms of that.
But many would argue probably that the human error no longer exists because it's now a computer that does things all the same at all times. There's an infinite attention span, for example, must be so much better.
Yes, well, unfortunately, humans build those systems and introduce a lot of errors into them. But I think that's proven false.
And the entire surrounding area might not necessarily be as smart as that one vessel.
That's right. Right. It needs to work in an imperfect world.
Yeah,
I was talking about the Waymo's. I remember at some point, those electrical autonomous cars in San Francisco were really risk averse, so they would even if they got priority, not take it. So they would chicken out basically out of any confrontation to avoid any collisions. And the bus drivers actually got used to this, so they knew that although they didn't have priority, they would actually go through, and then the Waymo would stop. And overnight they changed the algorithm, so it would be more assertive, and then collisions happened. So that's good. Talking about the human factor, huh? So, is there any risk particular to autonomous systems that we can talk about that we maybe didn't naturally think of?
So there has been some research. University of Genoa has done some excellent work around the predictability of vessels to avoid collisions, and using that as a way of making a vessel go where you want it to go. And that's been very effective. Certainly the research been effective. We haven't seen it in the real world being caused by a threat actor, but it's a real challenge because the ships have to act very predictably, and that's the nature of AI. They're not like a human. They're not going to make different decisions, so they can take advantage of that to actually make them in a situation where there's another vessel, whether it be a real vessel or a fake vessel, through AI spoofing or some other means, make it go somewhere you want. And that's, you think about threat actors on the sea, often one of the things they want to do is make you go where they want, so they can board you, or they can put you in danger.
Yeah, you had an example
they can
of
stop you
MCAT database last time we talked.
Exactly. They can stop you achieving whatever mission is. Perhaps it's a defense vessel. So there's more than enough reason for an adversary to want to do that.
Yeah, so Damen Shipyards is probably going to put a lot of effort in making sure those vessels do not collide with stuff. So there's algorithms in place then. And what you're saying is, once we understand this whole algorithm, we can actually also use it to our advantage to do harm.
True, but isn't that kind of like the rat race we're already facing, where we see it already in IT? That, of course, on one hand we see AI in our defense, but the same we see them in our attackers. That it's always going to be that the moment we think of something, that somebody else will think of a creative way to either abuse it or make it malfunction in such a way that the stuff happens which we really don't want to happen.
Yeah, true. But what's the solution here then? I mean, indeed, if you're saying, listen, if I jam the radar, so I'm going to force this vessel to crash into this other one. I mean, that is a nice attack.
Yes, I think that
because the difference with the real world is that an actual captain will then look outside and see, oh, there's another vessel. I'm really not going to steer to the left, although my navigational software says.
And maybe I heard on the radio them talking and thought, well, that sounds a bit weird what they're saying. There could be all other factors. I think, without trying to always be on the downside of automation, I think there are some advantages in these situations. The fact that an automated vessel, there's a lot of information we know about what's going on. We've got more visibility on an autonomous vessel than a normal vessel, and interesting. That's a challenge for crewed vessels right now, is getting that visibility for cybersecurity people to help them. Whilst an autonomous vessel, we've got lots of visibility. The other side of that is that if it's completely compromised, in some sort of attack where they've actually compromised the systems on board, we can't trust that information.
Yeah, and then it's a floating weapon, more or less.
Yeah.
Yeah, that must cross your mind as well.
Yeah, it doesn't stop me from sleeping yet, but that might happen in the future.
Is cybersecurity keeping up with those developments, or should we do better?
And kind of perhaps it depends on the definition, but I think that obviously we have a wide range of techniques to defend, but it also comes down to starting with the proper designs, and that's not necessarily cybersecurity. That's proper architecture, that's proper design proposals, and that's thinking in a way which sometimes also, especially also in the maritime industry, which wasn't the top of mind there. So I think the techniques are there, they're available, but it also requires much more of cybersecurity savviness in your engineering department, in the people who not necessarily had that in mind in the past. And as I said, certainly changing for the better, but it's also going very fast.
Mm-hmm. So is it hard to in your organization to make people aware of this and do those trainings? Or
Awareness is probably something which is relatively easy because everybody you have to live under a rock if you're not aware of all the risk we're facing. So that part isn't that difficult, but then doing the proper things in the right way, that is more of a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I can imagine that the benefit of creating an autonomous system is so big, and it's almost like a given.
Yeah, but as Stephen was mentioning earlier, it's the autonomous system. It's two ways. One, of course, you have to ensure that the system which operates autonomously is doing things in a safe manner. But you also have to be certain that that system itself cannot be compromised. Mm-hmm. And if I introduce something which might be easy to compromise once I get physical access to the vessel or whatsoever, then I might introduce something which is much more dangerous because then I have an autonomous vessel which could indeed be turned into the weapon as you were mentioning.
Mm-hmm. So it in a way, it almost sounds like it's easier with autonomous systems to secure the IT in those vessels compared to.
Once again, it really depends on the type of vessel. Mm-hmm. If it's a small vessel, if it's a relatively contained unit, then you can probably redesign it in such a way that it's less that people can't get access to it. Mm-hmm. If it's a big vessel, if it's a vessel which also needs to be serviced or whatsoever, then you are introducing something which could make it even more difficult. So, not necessarily agree with that one.
Mm-hmm. Now, I can imagine that it's everywhere in cybersecurity,
and it also becomes much more complex because obviously. We, as a shipbuilder, we have a lot of knowledge about building vessels. We definitely don't have all the knowledge on how to set up the perfect autonomous system. That's what we do with partners. Mm-hmm. And those partners nowadays are much more ingrained in the end product than in the past. In the past, they would do something, they would bring equipment on board, and they would leave. This also creates a whole different, a new level of trust. Not necessarily level of trust, but a new level of cooperation with those kind of organizations. They're also not they're mature, but it hasn't proven itself yet. So we're also in its early stages there. So it's definitely not a walk in the park from my point of view.
In previous episodes, I remember we talked about how it's difficult if you have a big supply chain of different systems. They all want remote access to a subsystem on a vessel. Does it, since everybody more recognizes that autonomous systems may be more of a big ecosystem, it's more they somehow have to work together. So it could even be an advantage.
Probably. We haven't seen it yet, but yeah. You could be right. But once again, and that's probably also because of the initiatives we're doing. We're doing them on a small scale with small vessels. Whether or not it scales up to complex vessels has to be seen in the future. I don't know at this moment yet. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't have a perfect solution for that at this moment. If I look at our organization, then we're thinking about that. We don't have a product there yet. So we're right now still focusing on the relatively smaller type of vessels.
And that's probably easier. Smaller is easier because there's less parties involved, etc.
Yeah. And also less risk, depending, of course, on the type of vessel. Because you can, for instance, if you're doing a nuclear waste carrier, then you're definitely not going to pilot anything with autonomy at this moment.
Stephen would probably advise you to start small.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing.
Keep it simple.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. So, and what else? What other advice could you give here? Because in order to put the right effort of cybersecurity in these systems is crucially important. But it could be quite a challenge, and maybe Hans is a little bit also in a huge organization that has their focus on cybersecurity, but there's probably many shipbuilders that don't. And they so what can we do?
I think that, like as in all cybersecurity, it's an arms race, in terms of what the attackers are doing. And the problem is innovations on the attacker's side. So we're always playing catch up. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem with any defensive measure. So we have to be much more cognizant of what the attackers are doing, what the new attacks are looking like, understanding how we protect from them, understanding how we respond to them. Mm-hmm. So it has to be the full spectrum of activity, not just what and certainly in other sectors, this was the case in the old days, is just this idea, let's build a castle and keep the enemy out with these high walls. And that's as outdated as the castle is in terms of cybersecurity. We've got to understand it's the age of constant compromise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds sounds really challenging, honestly. But there's also a public interest in that
Yes.
these things are going to be done well. I
Yes.
mean, and on the streets of Europe, you cannot have a autonomous car, for example, in international waters, but probably in most waters,
Yes.
it's much less regulated. How big of a risk is this? Because if suppose Hans sells 100 autonomous vessels, then someone else tweaks with the firmware, right?
Yes.
And it's out of his hands, and then some nation state controls all those and sends them all to the same spot and calls some kind of or to the Suez Canal or whatever. That is a risk, and there's no way as a government, for example, to somehow put measures in place. I think.
I think it comes down to the likelihood and the impact. It's like any risk management decision. If we understand that certain threat actors are doing that for a particular purpose, then obviously that's something that needs to be directly addressed. The problem is we can come up with lots of scenarios of all types of things that can happen, but lots of them, it's just not practical. We can't stop everything, but we can do certain things based on what we know about what the threat environment is, what the likely intent of threat actors is, because that's all cybersecurity threats are driven by threat actors. They don't exist with no threat actor, no threat. And that's what we have to think about. In the maritime sector, it's a very particular sort of environment. So we need to think clear, have that intelligence, that understanding of the threats, and drive legislation, but also technology that way.
But is it fast enough? Because if you are, so we talked last time about your Honey ShipNet.
Yes.
I can imagine you can make an autonomous digital twin.
Yes.
And have people hack into it and figure out. So then you know what people are doing.
Exactly.
But then if there's already lots of ships in there,
yes,
out there, what are you going to do then? Aren't we too late with that then?
I think we're never too late. I think that it's always going to be a challenge keeping up with that innovation. But the important thing is to understand what threats are being realized in the real world and understanding how to actually deal with those. And I think without that information, you're trying to do lots of things which might have limited effect without focusing on the things that are actually going to hit you. And we talked last time about Target. I think what's a great example is another big, I think it was Nordstrom, were hit by a cyber attack like 3 months earlier, exactly the same threat actor, and they took zero notice. They could have completely avoided their breach as a result. It's the same in all areas of cybersecurity. If you understand what threat actors are doing in the space, then you can build for it. I mean, it's much harder in the shipbuilding industry because the lead time is quite long. But I think we need to make systems resilient in terms of basic cyber hygiene, but also think about, okay, when something goes wrong, what are we going to do? Like think about those decision making.
But that sounds like the only solution, more or less, is that combined. We'll ask Hans if that exists. Combined the CISO club of the shipbuilders.
Yeah.
Somehow make a pact and say, listen, we're going to share everything we see. We're going to build these digital twins to figure out what's going on, and we're going to adapt quickly in our software to do this. It sounds a bit like security operations centers or IT. Actually, we'll talk a bit about what we can learn from that as well.
Yes,
in a bit. But it sounds like initiatives like this have to be there, and it has to come from the private sector. Then,
yeah. I mean, I suppose one of the challenges in the shipbuilding sector is the fact that it's an international business, and I think China's a top shipbuilder, followed by South Korea, followed by Japan. So it's actually quite a diverse industry. It's not like in the Netherlands we build.
Yeah.
What's the percentage of the total ships?
Once again, depends on the market, of course.
Yeah.
It's for tugs, it's pretty big. But for container vessels, it's zero.
Yep.
So, yeah. No, we're definitely on a global market. If you take the whole of the maritime industry or all the shipbuilders, we're definitely a small player. If you do so, totally agree.
Yeah, okay, but who builds the system? I mean, is that a shipbuilder or is it a contractor of the shipbuilder?
It's usually a contractor.
Yeah. So it's
It kind of depends, of course, on the shipbuilder. You might have systems where you say, okay, we have our own kind of agnostic layer on top of it, where you plug in all the subcomponents, but the majority of the systems on board will be built by subcontractors. on any type of vessel.
Yeah, but Damen does feel responsible for this to select the
At
right
the end of the
ones.
day, we are responsible because from a legal point of view, the moment we deliver a vessel, we are responsible. So
It's completely different from the software industry, right?
Yes.
Where the first thing you do is you're on your own when things go south. Bugs you're responsible for our bugs. That's but it's not. We could learn this from.
Okay. To a certain extent, it is like this. The moment you hand over a ship, then obviously it is. But the moment you start offering digital services, and also as Damen, we are also looking into. Well, we're trying to reinvent SaaS. We're doing ship as a service, which means that we're going to be the owner also during operations, which makes us responsible. So, but we are indeed responsible the moment we deliver a vessel, that stuff which is being handed over by subcontractors, which is installed in the vessel, at the end of the day, we are responsible if they screw up.
Yeah, whether it's legal or not, you also feel responsibility because it's also bad for you, of course. And that's completely different in the software industry because somehow we all accept that if my laptop crashes, that it's my fault because I should have. What can we learn from IT? So because what we're talking about here is OT, so systems that are controlled by software, of course, but it's not like VMs and containers and all that that's in the and laptops and all that. But maybe there's lots of things. Doesn't it look more like it since the IT component in those vessels is going to be bigger? What can we learn then?
I think, and some companies are doing this where they treat a vessel just like the head office, and the same sort of IT controls are there for the OT systems. The same sort of technologies are used, and it's architected the same way as it architect the head office. Where they had other data. So, and while that isn't necessarily exactly everything you need on a vessel, it certainly would improve the current situation.
There's not many organizations, maybe maritime sector is an exception, but in many industries, we have the IT responsible person and we have the OT responsible person. That always boggles. I do understand there's differences there, but the vision, the thought, I believe, especially from cyber defense, should be the same.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I don't see this in the real world at the moment.
I think some CISOs are now in control of both. Like I think that's it's not necessarily 50%, but it's a large percentage where the CISO is responsible for both areas.
In the maritime industry?
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
It's increasing, but it's definitely not across the board. It's not there everywhere, but it is definitely moving that way. Absolutely.
Yeah, especially if you have subcontractors. I mean, that's such a different time. But that is a cultural change, I think.
It is,
especially in large organizations.
And also within the IT sector, we cultivated that as well, because many of my peers in the CISO, they didn't want to really go into that part because we all know that, especially if we're talking about OT security, then 9 out of 10 times you're talking about older systems, you're talking about complicated systems, you're talking about systems which you can't really patch, and that's quite often the first approach we tend to do.
CISO's 10 things to do. First one is patch everything, and then then the factory says no.
Yep,
because it's gonna bring our system down, maybe potentially, and so we're not gonna do it. So that's there's a lot of work to be done.
It's an incredibly challenging position to be in as a CISO, like that, to have such disparate environments you're responsible for. But I think that's how security needs to work.
Yeah, agreed.
How are we gonna get there? Honestly, I think it's hard. This is maybe the hardest part of what we're doing.
Yeah, let's hope it's not driven by disaster.
True. Yeah. Well, but even then, I mean, how many examples do you? There's a whole.
True. We have an MCAT indeed. We have quite a few on file.
How many examples do you want? Apparently, this doesn't help. Examples of where things went wrong doesn't change behavior in organizations. Apparently, to me, this is the.
I disagree with that one because if it happens something in your own organization, then usually it does. But if something happens to your neighboring organization, there will always be an explanation why. Okay, but we're different. We're not doing it that way. So indeed, yeah. But you don't. But let's also be realistic. You really don't want to have those kind of incidents happening in your organization.
Yeah. So you'd better learn.
Yeah,
from
you better
them
be
and
prepared
go to
for
the
it.
database.
Yeah.
But is there anything that you guys can help fellow CISOs or leaders in the maritime industry to put this better on the agenda?
Start by asking the right questions, I would say, because what you will see that in many maritime organizations that things like that is something where I wouldn't say people are blissfully unknown. That's absolutely not true, but they don't really understand the ramifications of it.
Mm-hmm.
So start by asking the right questions. Start by doing some kind of threat modeling. Start by doing, albeit just a simple table job, just do some scenarios. What could possibly go wrong there?
Mm-hmm.
And then you will hopefully get the organization along that they start to have more realization on this one. Start to educate people. Start to educate them in all sorts of things. Start also your engineering. Start to educate them in how to do security by design if you're talking about those kinds of things. So it's all raising awareness.
Mm-hmm.
It's raising education.
Yeah, I know it's a big part of what you're doing because you're recognized. But so whose job is that then? That means that if you are a CISO of a main office IT department of any shipbuilder or supplier to you, for example, you need to take responsibility. It may not be in your job description.
Yeah. True to a certain extent, but what you also need to do is you do stakeholder management. You need to make sure that the people who's responsible for that type of product, that they take mutual responsibility. Because if you're as IT taking the sole responsibility for this, you're screwed.
Mm-hmm.
Because they will, people already in many organizations always point at IT, and then their way of pointing only becomes bigger because then they have OT to blame IT for as well. Mm-hmm. And then I really pity the CISO whatsoever. I think actually the worst thing from a CISO perspective, what you can do is claim that you're the sole guardian of this. It's a mutual ownership. At the end of the day, indeed, you might be the one who sets out the strategy. But if you can't get those people to understand why you're doing this, then you're doing it wrong.
So it's the business units that are responsible, and it's your job to help them understand.
At the end of the day, they are responsible for that type of product you're doing. It can't be that they say, okay, well, I'm responsible for everything, apart from the security part.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we talked about this last time.
Yeah, and I just think, as you were saying, if you can get them to understand, and we talked about this last time, is that all that could happen. That's the great lesson.
Yeah.
When this threat is realized, and they say, "Oh, okay," and I'd be responsible for that. And then when that lesson happens, that's when you really get their attention.
Yeah. So there is a way, at least.
There is a way.
Yeah. What struck me when it comes to awareness to C-level or to leadership is making things really tangible and really simple. Actually, behind you, Hans, you very well know this. Not a real vessel, but it's
definitely not a Damen vessel. But yeah,
no, but it's the technology right there is real world technology, and we actually demonstrated in previous episodes. We'll put a link in the show notes how easy it can be to capsize the ship, so that the containers fall off. And honestly, when we developed this internally, I was like, yeah, but from a technical perspective, this is so simple. What is there to gain? Because of course, there's almost no security in this whole system. So of course we're going to hack it. Of course we're going to make the ship cause problems. But then when we showed it to people were really awed because they're like, oh wow, so it's that easy that this could happen. So it's on that very base. Sometimes you forget if you are a researcher or you are a teacher or you are a CISO and all in the field. We take things for granted that can go wrong, and we should probably make it simpler and get out with it. Actually, one of the reasons we have this podcast is to do that and to show how simple it is, and maybe that helps a lot. I mean, we're more than happy to make the boat capsize a little bit anywhere for everybody who wants to understand. But if that one got autonomous and we would put it on somewhere outside, I wouldn't, not even that one. I wouldn't even trust it outside because I know how easy it is to get in there.
True.
So there's all right, gentlemen. In closing, what should we do? What should be the practical advice? Is there anything that we should prioritize, that we should give the industry that should do? And that could be for the maritime industry, for autonomous system, but maybe those are things that are also valuable to people who are not necessarily building a ship.
I think to a certain extent realization that of course things are moving at a ridiculous pace. Mm-hmm. And that if you don't keep up, the distance behind is only going to increase, and which also is going to increase your risk. And I think it's also a matter of constantly raising the awareness in your organization outside of the people who are already knowledgeable about. 9 out of 10 times your IT organization already knows. That's not the issue. It's going to be your OT organization. It's going to be product development. So cross boundaries there to do that.
Yeah, so your OT department should go to the IT and say, hey, listen, what amazing bad stuff have you lived through? Tell me. I don't want to live the same thing.
I think that would definitely help in many organizations, because right now you will see that in many organizations those are completely separate.
Mm-hmm.
So at least start the dialogue, and also doing things like what we did with Hack the Boat is make it visible. Many people, and I think Stephen can elaborate on that. It really helps just showing what can go wrong, and that's the reason, of course, why we did this together. And make it visible. Obviously, we didn't want to make it too visible. It was a Damen vessel, because then marketing would kill me. But in this way, this is easy, and this really helps.
We removed all the Damen protections to show it.
It would be impossible with a Damen vessel. And moving on.
Yeah, I think it's really important. A bit of a shameless plug for research, but I think if shipbuilders and people in the industry would work more closely with researchers, cybersecurity researchers, and not just. Well, there's lots of groups that are working on cybersecurity, the University of Plymouth, Talon Tech, University of North Carolina, amongst others. So there's lots of good research at University of Genoa, which I mentioned, who are doing some great work. I think there's great opportunity to work with researchers to understand how threats might manifest themselves, understand a bit better about things that have happened in the past, and then make the decision-making around designing and protecting vessels better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the knowledge is out there. That's not a problem. Yeah. We got to look for it and tell people to go look for it.
Yeah.
And is it fair to say that cybersecurity should evolve in organizations that create autonomous systems, at least at the pace of the autonomous systems itself?
I think that would be
absolutely
okay. Yeah. Well, let's conclude with that then.
Super.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your insights today and for giving us a peek into the world of the maritime industry going forward and making sure that our world supply chain, and now I mean the physical one, is actually going to stay there and stay safe. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Happy to be here.
And to our viewers, thank you very much for tuning in today. If you liked what you saw, please like it. It helps us spread the word. And that's really close to the subscribe button. If you press that as well, then next time you will have another episode of Threat Talks in your inbox as well. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to Threat Talks, a podcast by Onto It Cybersecurity and M6. Did you like what you heard? Do you want to learn more? Follow Threat Talks to stay up to date on the topic of cybersecurity.